Next item, please.
Next, Mr. Thomas Wall will come and present the 2022-2023 second budget revision and 2023-2024 budget.
Good evening, President Barry, Dr. Maleko, and members of the board, staff, and community. We're going to go through the budget hearing and process, which is a presentation, and as part of public comment, people can also come up and talk about any budgets or concerns they have about the budget. That's just our mission statement. It's always important to remember why we're here. We're here for students first. And this is just some data. So we're at a $448 million budget. This is down slightly from the last couple of years from all the pandemic of ESSER funds and CARES funds that we've had. So we're slightly lower than we have been in previous years. The buildings have stayed the same. The number of students have actually downgraded just a little bit because we are expecting a slight loss. This is just a quick visual presentation of all our budget funds because we are required by law to spend money in specific places in our budget. Again, with the most restricted from the right side moving left. So our general fund, which is on the far left side, is the least restrictive. And our philosophy has always been spend the restricted funds as much as possible first. That leaves your unrestricted funds, which you have more capability to do different things with those least restrictive funds. Just a couple of things that have changed on here. You'll see that on the bottom right, the building and site fund, we have the school improvement funds. Those are the energy bonds that we just closed on May 23rd for energy improvements in the buildings. And then also comes with a corresponding 2023 school improvement bonds in the debt fund as we pay that money back. Even though it's coming from the general fund, we transfer it to the debt fund to make those debt payments. And feel free to interrupt me as we go along. Otherwise, I'll keep this moving because I know we have
Please.
a full agenda. All right, so right now we're looking at an increase in our foundation level. That's a typo. It should be 450, not 359. I had some issues with the presentation not updating. But again, the hold harmless law, that was a big issue for us this last year. If you remember in 21-22, the law changed, but they didn't catch it until November. And obviously, we already levy our taxes, majority of our taxes in the summertime. So you'll see a 3-year swing here in our tax rates, which is very hard for the public to understand. But back in 21-22, the state law changed where we should have reduced our hold harmless millage at that time. So what we did in 22-23, the current school year, we didn't levy any hold harmless to kind of make up for the over levy in 21-22. Now that we're in 23-24, looking forward for the next tax year, we're about $1 million short of paying back that shortfall. So that's impacting our 23-24 rate slightly to go down a little bit, and we'll go through that in more detail later. But after that, we'll be back on the normal schedule of whatever our normal hold harmless millage rate is, we'll be going forward. Obviously, there's increases in compensation, supply materials, and absenteeism has always been an issue that we've been dealing with the last couple of years. This is just a pictorial showing where the state aid school fund is. The state meets twice a year, once in January and once in May, where they look at the revenue projections for the current year and the next two subsequent fiscal years for the state, which is October through September. This just shows you the biggest pieces are from the state sales tax, the individual income tax, and the other revenue is that the larger portion is that 6 mills that we see on all property taxes. That helps funds the school aid fund. For the last couple of years, the economy has been doing very well. So there's been a lot of money because a lot of these things, income tax and sales tax, has been based on a good economy. So back in January, they gave us a nice estimate that there's a lot of money in the school aid fund and general fund. When they met just a couple of weeks ago in May, they actually increased those levels. So there's additional money available. So there's a lot of money. Now, obviously, it goes through the legislative process where the Senate, House, and the governor's budgets are all combined for the last May revenue consensus meeting a couple weeks ago, and they have yet to come out with a conference report showing where they have agreed on what the state aid will look like going forward. So at this point in the budget hearing process or the budget development process, we do not have a good understanding where the state funding is, but we know it's going to be a large increase. And this just kind of gives you the definition. So those that want to look later to see what each category covers, they kind of talk about where the money comes in for the school aid fund. Looking at a more global perspective for the United States and Michigan, This kind of just shows you the consumer price index as it has gone through for the last, 30 some years. You can see we had a large increase during the pandemic as the inflation rates for the demand was also so short, so they pushed up the prices. You see we have come down a little bit. We haven't gotten back to where we were before, but it is starting to level out, which is good to see. On the inflation, is devouring the personal income gains. Even though we're giving more larger money to our employees for the wages through the pandemic and projected additional money for this upcoming year, inflation has eaten a lot of that money up. So even though you're giving gains, the amount of money doesn't go as far as it used to. So it's just something to be aware of. School aid fund revenue, same thing. Even though you can see the blue line, which is our school aid revenue, has been increasing all the years, but so has inflation. So even though that eats into our revenue source of what we can do with the additional revenue we're getting, doesn't go as far just like the personal income. Labor force, that's been a one that we've been struggling with, obviously with the capability of filling positions. Even now, we're still struggling filling positions. You have a large, reduction in our custodial staff that are actually people that want to come to work and actually work in our teacher force. It goes across almost all groups. So we're going to see that we're continuing to have that kind of an issue. And just look on the Michigan side, again, you can see it peaked back in January of 2002. It's been slowly declining. A lot of changes since the pandemic, but again, it's starting to level out. So hopefully we'll start seeing some of those positions get filled for people coming back into the labor force. All right, looking at our taxable values, we just got that 2 weeks ago, and some of the breakdown between commercial and industrial just came last week. So our taxable values are increasing about 4.7% in total on our tax base. If you look at your individual tax bills in your homes, you get that, notice back in February of what your house value is. It usually goes up by the rate of inflation or 5%, whichever is lower. So most houses probably saw about a 5% increase in their taxable values. That's not the cash value of the house, but just the taxable value portion. We had to make an adjustment for the hold harmless, as I talked about before, of roughly about $1.8 million we had to affect this year. Looking at the foundational allowances, you can see where our projections have been. Back in 21-22, we got about $171. Then 22-23, it was $359, and we're estimating $480 for next year. So that is built into our budget. Again, not having any final direction from the state is an estimate at this time. When looking at expenses, recent our contracts all kind of follow the foundation tie. So in the budget is 4.8% for the increase in our expenses for instructional staff and all staff actually. Again, staying with our traditional program. Again, each budget year is based upon the previous program. So we build that as a similar model going forward. And we actually are reducing our reserves that we send to the Building and Site Fund. We're coming off the last year of the pandemic. So next year is what they call the cliff year because the pandemic funds go away. So we're not able to offset some of our operating funds. So our transfers we've been doing the last 3 years are going to significantly go down from previous years. This is our L4029 that we give to the cities and the county for our taxes. You'll see on the very first line our hold harmless millage. In the past, that has been as high as 6.85. In the last couple of years before this, it was 6.17. Last year, it was 0 to kind of get back to paying back the change that was in the 21-22 school year. And next year, we're looking at 2.04. So that was 0 last year. It'll be 2.04 this year. Now, normally it would have been closer to 2.6, but since we had to pay back part of that last part of the 2001 or 21-22 year, that's why it's actually slightly lower than what you normally see. So going forward, we'll see that around 2.5 mils going forward. The other thing you'll see that on line 3 is our debt millage. That was previously 4.82 back in 2019. The last couple of years has been 3.5, and now it's going down to 1.35. So you'll actually see a reduction on your tax bills for our debt funds.
Could I interrupt you for a second? Can you explain that again, please, for the public?
So basically, when we have gone out to the public in the past for a bond issue, we usually have done a 20-year payback. So the 2002 bonds, 20 years ago, would now have been 2022, are going off the books. So for the 2023 levy, now we're just dealing with the 2014 bond.
Okay, great.
In the last couple of years, we've actually done 3 refundings in the last 5 years that has helped bring that rate even lower because of the refinancing of the lower interest rates to actually make the payments back lower than it be. So that would actually much lower than what we originally expected back in 2014.
Thank you.
And so for here forward, that number will slowly go down as we keep continuing to pay off the 2014 bonds, which we paid off in 2030 in totality. All right, looking at our foundation increase, this kind of just shows you a pictorial where it's been. And I know the numbers are small, but don't really pay attention to the numbers. It's just seeing the trend of the school aid fund. Obviously, back in 2017-18, when we lost that 470, everybody took a reduction in wages at that time, and it slowly has increased since then. And we're actually higher than we were back in 2016 when we lost all that money. So just looking at the curve, you can see the student aid fund has been doing very well the last couple of years. You can see that sharp incline. Again, you have to take in effect the inflation that's moderating that a little bit, but we've had a lot more money to work with in this last year.
Just real quick, put the inflation on the side. When we took that loss in the foundation, all of our employees are whole now because of the hit they took.
As part of the pandemic funds, we worked through that. We gave people double steps and things like that to kind of get them back to where they should have been prior to that loss back of the 470.
I just wanted to make sure that got out. Thank you.
Now, I won't go through this next slide. The next one, for those that want to dig into the data, it kind of shows you the history of the foundation allowance. There's obviously the different types. We're a hold harmless district, so we're always slightly less a lot of times than the regular districts. So it kind of shows you where, even though some of the revenues from the smaller districts have gone greatly, we have gone a little slower. What the whole idea with the proposal A was to kind of bring the funding gap together. So if you look at the next slide, the very last line, so back then, we were probably, $3,000 higher than your lower school districts, but now lower districts are at $9,150, and we're at $9,372. So they've closed that gap considerably over the years since 2003-04 when Proposal A was put into place. So at some point, when those two catch up, we will no longer be a hold harmless district. But again, we don't have control of that. That's a legislative issue of how they do funding for schools. So at some point, that 2.04 this year, 2.5, going forward, will eventually go to zero when those two items meet.
Trustee Petchkoff?
Well, and I was going to ask this after, but since you brought that up, that hold harmless is expiring in 2024 where we have to go back
Correct.
to the voters. What kind of numbers would we be looking at since we're not exactly sure we are closing that gap to the point where we won't be able to,
That's a good question. So back when Proposal A was first put into place, and I wrote these numbers down so I wouldn't forget them. Originally, when Proposal A was passed, we were allowed to levy additional $593 per pupil. And so you take the $593 times our student population, that generates a dollar value that we would levy, for hold harmless districts. Now, over time, depending on your student count and the taxable values, that number could have slightly changed, but the dollar value always stayed the same. In 21-22, they lowered that $593 down to $313 per pupil. So we're allowed to levy that $313 by the number of students, and that's the money we have levied. As long as that foundation allowance stays the same, the difference that we're slightly higher than the lower districts, that number will always stay the same until that happens.
so if we were to go to the voters again for
Correct.
the next hold harmless before it ends in 2024, it will be with that number
Right.
of
So
the 313.
the portion
per
that we
the-
levy upon is roughly about $2 billion. So that's raising $4 million for us right now, based on the millage calculation. Because you take your taxable value divided by 1,000 times the number of mills. So right now, we're levying that additional $4 million on our property taxes, in addition $1 million from the state. So that $5 million has to be renewed, otherwise we will lose that revenue.
Okay,
Because the
thank
state has determined in their calculations, whether you levy or not, the state expects you to levy it, and there doesn't give you the difference.
They're not going, they're not going to reimburse us if
So
we
that would
don't.
be an actual reduction in our operating budget of roughly about $5 million. So at this point, not knowing where the legislature is going to go, I would recommend doing the election, but the board always has the right to not levy it. And actually, if the numbers do catch up legally, then we would not even have the right to levy it.
We couldn't do it anyway.
Correct.
Right.
Dr.
And,
Maliko?
and also, can you comment on the non-homestead as well? Because that, I know.
Correct. So as part of this whole school funding formula, 18 mills is levied on non-homestead property. So that's your businesses, your second homes, apartment complexes. That 18 mills is part of our foundational allowance. So that raises roughly about $33 million for us. Just an example, let's say we levy, actually I have the number exactly later, but let's say it's $2 million. We would actually have to, if we don't levy that $33 million, the state's only going to pay us that 167 difference. So whether we levy that 33 million or not, the state assumes again that we actually levy that money to get our full foundation money of roughly $200 million. That make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does she like it is a different question.
Yes. So they're actually, to actually renew the millages, we have to do both the hold harmless 18 mills and
And-
a
right.
homestead millage of whatever 2.5, whatever it will be going forward.
Go ahead.
Can I just, thank you. Can I just make another point too, that is actually for our operation. That's for operation.
Correct.
That's
Both
that's
those
not
are in our general
restricted just
fund.
for infrastructure. This is for actually the operation of the district, staff, and other things that support our students.
Right, it's our least restrictive funds. We can use that for any purpose. That's on our left side of our visual of our pots of funds. Okay,
Continue, please.
so this is just another pictorial graph showing where our foundation allowance is in the blue, our DFs, or actually, we just use an example of our DFT salaries in the red, and the actual retirement in the yellow. So this, again, the school officials, anybody that's a school employee is entitled to participate in the retirement fund for the state of Michigan for public school employees. So we pay a retirement rate on every dollar on that retirement rate. As you can see in the yellow, it keeps going up faster than even what we're getting in revenue. And that's basically upon the actuary funds of that if everybody retired and went their life age of when that pension and what that obligation is that we have to fund on an annual basis. So it just kind of shows you that that's another big figure we have to pay attention to as we work our budgets. This is our student count, so we're actually looking at a slight decrease in students. Again, this is based on the FTE count, it's not actually head count. We are looking at a slight reduction in students. This is looking at the revenue consensus numbers. So again, I won't go too far into that, but it just shows you again that there's additional money coming in that they expect for this upcoming budget year. All right, this is what we do for our school models. Again, we do a best case, worst case, and a most likely case. When we get to this point, we're adopting our most likely budget. So some of the highlighted numbers you want to pay attention to is obviously we're looking at a surplus this year, so we wouldn't be surprised if we actually get additional money. Again, because you budget things for utilities and salaries. Unfortunately, people don't work their full time or utilities come in lower. So we actually expect to get a slight increase. That's the first one of $554,000. Our actual FTE loss will calculate out to about 21 students for next year, less. Our benefits are going up 1.3%. We expect roughly about 30 retirements on a most likely scenario. Foundation increase is going up 450. So you put that all together, we're looking at, basically break even next school year based on the assumptions of our revenue and expenses. Oh, one thing to notice on that, if you notice that our actual fund balance percentages go down because we have a lot less of the ESSER funds that we have had in the past or pension supplements when they give us for one-time money. This just gives you the calculation of looking at the foundation allowance. We'll actually go into a little more smaller numbers so you can, I guess we're not going to go that. I didn't put all those extra slides in. I was trying to keep it fast. So you look at the highlighted sections. Again, we're looking at the far right where that $450 increase in our most likely scenario. Most of the times we'll actually adopt the far right column, but we have not had any consensus reports coming out yet. Our student loss is roughly about 21 students. And again, on the bottom, the additional cost is based upon looking at a foundation increase of roughly 4.8% in our staffing cost, tying into what our $450 percentage increase is for our foundation increase. Again, obviously we don't have anything brought to the board yet for any kind of contract settlements. So if you look at the whole budget, about 70% of our revenue were unknown and about 85% of our expenses are unknown. So again, but we're required by law to adopt a budget by July 1st. A lot of it's based on estimates. This is looking at some of the larger changes. Won't get too far into that, but it talks about our unit budget. The unit budget will remain the same from the previous year. We have some changes in MIPSR's money, one-time funds, but this is just our tracking mechanism to know what's changing in the budget. So we won't go into too many details, but I'll gladly sit down with anyone that's interested to really get into more of the details of the budget. Again, on the ESSER funds, as you can see, the ESSER Fund 3 is coming to conclusion on the September of 2023. So the ESSER funds will be expiring at that point. The only funds we'll have after that using the timings minute, so we basically get one more year out of the construction funds. So a lot of the ESSER construction will happen this summer and next summer, and that will use the remaining of our ESSER funds. Now, majority of the money, about roughly 8 million ESSER funds, is what they were calling about the funding cliff for schools if they didn't prepare for that. Fortunately enough, we were able to use our at-risk funds that we got a large increase for this last year, and it's expected to continue. So we didn't have to put too much money back in the general fund. That's why we're in such a good standing right now and not have to make any staffing cuts. So the amount of volume for substitutes, as you can see, absenteeism has still been an issue for us. It could be leaves, it could be absentees, just people being more sick. It could have been health leaves. It could be a variety of reasons. We haven't delved too far into that, but a lot of people suggest we get into those details and see why. Prior to the pandemic, it was about 2.3, 2.4 million. Now we're getting closer to 6 million. So there's a variety of reasons in there that we'll dig into and kind of find out what really has been causing that number. And obviously the actual cost of substitutes, what we pay per day, has also gone up, just so we make sure we get enough substitutes that come to Dearborn versus another district that might have been paying higher. So there's a variety of variables in there. The UAL adjustment, unfortunately, that yellow line you saw that was going up is expected to increase 3% next year. So that's another cost we have to absorb into the budget. We talked about the CARES and ESSER funds. We talked about inflation, so I won't go through a lot of that. Again, infrastructure is a big item for us. We need to come up with a short-term or long-term that the board has kind of helped drive that direction. At-risk funding we talked about, and we are putting a large investment in curriculum also that is coming from the instructional side to look at different types of textbooks and curriculum models. This again just looks at the totality by fund. In the general fund, we have the general fund, enhancement fund, and athletics is in the general fund. Special revenue funds are all our grant funds that we have. The debt fund, capital project. So you can see just on a big picture of where we're at on the amendment number 2, which is the end of this year. Big thing to show up was our debt fund. We're not levying additional taxes, but when we had the money come in for the school improvement bonds, that's why that number is larger than what we normally would have seen. Same thing on the capital project side. So obviously revenue is coming in. When you get a bond, you put the bond proceeds in the capital project, you put the liability in the debt fund. So that's why both those numbers are inflated by that roughly $11 million. Look on the downside, you'll see that we started looking at a deficit for the general fund, but that is again coming from the enhancement fund of using monies we have raised in previous years. And again, the state aid funds, you'll see that it's higher than what we budgeted back in January. Roughly in December, the state has said they have so much money in their coffer that they actually gave us an additional $16 million to pay down that MIPSR's liability. So we would get that on the 20th of the month, and that following Monday, we would have to pay that money back. So it doesn't increase our profit or loss for the year, but it has to flow through the state or from us into the MIPSR's fund. So that's unfortunately just arbitrarily inflates our numbers, hence why that percentage of fund balance looks a little higher or lower because of these one-time money that we get and we pay it directly right back. And just kind of showing you where our fund balance is at the end of roughly about 36 million, which is down from 39 million from the year before. On the 23-24 projections, again, you can see where the debt fund obviously was 11 or actually 13 million the year before is down to 5. That's because we're levying that 1.35 mils versus the 3.5 the year before. Again, the transfers money, that number has gone up because even the savings from the general fund for the utility savings is what's paying back that. So that's why the money gets transferred from the general fund into the debt fund. So that's where the payments are made out of the debt fund. On the capital side, you can see that we still have a large money. That's going to be from this summer and through the year of using most of those ESSER funds and the school improvement funds. As you can see there, our total expenditures, they're going to be lower than the previous year because of that one time of $16 million we got the year before. Again, our fund balances look to be roughly about $35 million for next school year, at the end of next school year is an estimate. So key issues. This is the last slide before the thank you slide. Obviously, we have to wait for the finalization of the school aid fund from the state of Michigan. That could normally happen in sometime June, early July. Lots of wild guesses. You know, there's nothing really to base it upon for what we've heard so far to date. We have to currently monitor to the end of this school year. The fall instructional program will continue on the traditional format. Negotiations are ongoing and using estimates for staffing based upon our foundation increases, what we've been doing for our staffing costs for the last couple of years. For the staffing adjustments next year, we're not looking at any reductions. So everybody's basing their staffing based upon their current staffing models. There might be some changes in the types of classes, but not basically on the total FTEs. And again, our class size is the lowest as it's been in a long time, so we're expecting to maintain that. And there are some additional staffing positions that are being added. For example, we never know at the start of next school year, we always have hotspots. So we set aside a reserve of FTEs for the administrators to use to handle those hotspots. Those are included and built into the budget. Infrastructure, that's another big item. It's one of the biggest items we're going to have to deal that are large numbers. And I do believe we have a study session on July to kind of take the next step in that process. And that is it.
Before we get into questions, is there any members of the public that would like to address the board regarding the budget revision?
Yeah,
Just
so as part of the
regarding
state
this
law.
part, budget
Correct.
revision. Okay, thank you. Trustee Watts?
Can you remind us, so that the last finance meeting, it wasn't reported yet, our credit rating?
Correct.
So what was it and where are we?
So the traditional school district is usually a BAA3. We are actually an A1. So it's almost 4 steps higher than what normally was.
Okay.
And they attribute that to obviously looking at our finances, where our history of our fund balance has been, what our stability of the district is. And unfortunately, the whole pension system from the state of Michigan brings us down.
So going forward, knowing that we're going to have a reduction in our fund balance, is that going to affect us then next year for our credit rating?
So typically when we do that, it's like an hour-long interview with the rating agency, and they want to know you have a plan.
Okay.
So if you remember, we have the Meritorious Budget Award where we actually budget out 3 years. Once this gets adopted, we start working on that. So they always want to see a plan of where you're going and how you're going to handle that reduction in fund balance. So usually once they see our plan model and that 300-page report we have for that, they're very comfortable that they have an idea of where they're going, and that gives them the sense of calm that we're actually having a plan and are working the plan.
Only 300 pages?
Yes.
Trustee Petrikov?
Okay, well, I got a lot of questions, but I won't go through them all tonight. One of the things to take on about the fund balance, the state requires
A minimum of 5%.
5%.
If you're under
We're-
5%, you're a going concern and you have to do additional
Right.
reporting.
We're at about 15%, correct? And that enables us to, because of that stability with that fund balance, that our savings account, so to speak, if we do go out for borrowing money,
Correct.
we get a much better rate
Correct.
of interest. So it's always important to be mindful of what our savings looks like, as well as knowing that at any given moment, we could have an emergency, especially with the amount of buildings that we have, that could take away from the fund balance for any particular reason.
Right, because our state aid funding, 70% of that, we don't have control of that.
We don't,
If
right.
they go up and down with that, we use our fund balance to kind of smooth
We
that.
have to
so we
use,
don't.
right, we have to maintain a basic safety net.
Correct.
The other question, and we saw this over and over again, is, and we're actually going to be voting on some adjustments because of absenteeism and the need for filling in positions with outside contracts,
Correct.
basically. How are we because we don't really always know what that is going to look like. We're at the mercy of whatever players are out there and what they may or may not do with their costs to us. Have you, I'm assuming, calculated that into these numbers as well?
Correct, because we currently have a lot of those in place now. And we actually, if we don't have it in place, we put money aside for that. Now, if they're in the staffing model or in the contracted services side, they're in the budget. Now, obviously, we can't forecast who may or may
Right.
not be around, but that's why we have an amendment twice a year, once in January timeframe and once in June to kind of make up that difference, so we know what we're going to end up at the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.